The wind howled across the endless stretch of white, carrying with it a cruel bite that cut through layers of fabric and into the bone. Eliza tightened her arms around little Daniel, pulling the worn woolen blanket tighter around his trembling body. Snowflakes stung her cheeks like needles, and her breath rose in faint clouds that froze almost as soon as they left her lips. She had been strong for so long, holding herself together for her son after her husband's death. But tonight, the merciless frontier winter was testing her strength beyond measure. The wagon had broken down hours ago. One wheel splintered against a hidden rock buried beneath the snow, and before she could even react, their only horse had bolted into the blizzard, frightened by the crack of ice breaking in the distance. She had chased after it for a few desperate steps before realizing it was hopeless. The storm had swallowed the animal whole, its shadow disappearing into a wall of white. Now there was nothing left. No horse, no wagon, no shelter. Just a mother, a child, and the unrelenting cold. Daniel clung to her chest, his small arms weak, his face pale. "Mama, I'm cold," he whispered, his voice so faint it broke her heart. She kissed the top of his head, though her lips were nearly frozen. "Hold on, my sweet boy. Just a little longer. We'll find shelter." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were hollow. The land around them stretched endlessly, covered in deep snowdrifts. The storm blurred every landmark, turning trees into ghosts and hills into faceless mounds of ice. Eliza could barely see 5 feet ahead. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, her boots sinking deep into the powder, filling with icy wetness that numbed her toes. Her skirts were soaked and stiff, dragging her down with every movement. But worse than her own suffering was the sound of Daniel's breathing. It had grown shallow, uneven, as if each inhale was a battle his small lungs were losing. His lips were no longer pink but turning blue. She rubbed his back furiously, trying to create warmth, rocking him in her arms, whispering prayers. "Oh Lord, don't take him," she pleaded into the storm. "Take me if you must, but not him. Not my boy." Memories flashed through her mind in that desperate moment. The day Daniel was born, his tiny cries filling her with joy. The way her husband John had held him proudly, his rough cowboy hands trembling as he cradled their son. John had sworn to keep them safe, to give them a life better than the one they'd left back east. But John was gone, now taken by a fever the previous spring, and Eliza had been left to carry the burden alone. Every mile she had walked since, every trial she had endured, had been for Daniel. To lose him now in the snow felt like the cruelest end of all. Her knees buckled, sending her crashing down into the snow. She tried to rise, but her legs trembled too hard, her strength draining away. She sank deeper, clutching Daniel tightly to her chest, curling herself around him as a shield. Her tears froze against her lashes, but she didn't care. She pressed her face into his hair, whispering lullabies through chattering teeth. "Sleep, my darling. Mama's here." Mama won't let go. The wind roared louder, and the night pressed in. Darkness had fallen hours ago, but in the storm, it was impossible to tell where the horizon ended and the sky began. Eliza's eyes grew heavy. The warmth she tried to give Daniel was slipping away, replaced by a terrible numbness that crept over her limbs. She knew what it meant. Hypothermia. The cold was winning. Still, she refused to give up. She adjusted Daniel in her arms, rocking him, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She prayed for a miracle, anything, anyone that might come to their rescue. But the wilderness was silent, save for the moan of the storm. For a fleeting moment, she thought she heard something beyond the wind, a sound foreign to the storm's voice. The faint, rhythmic pounding of hooves? Or was it only her mind, slipping into delusion as the cold claimed her? She lifted her head weakly, squinting into the blizzard, her heart torn between hope and despair. If there truly was a rider out there, it might be her last chance. If not, then the snow would be their grave. Eliza pressed one last kiss to her son's temple and whispered, "Hold on, my love. Just hold on a little longer." And then, through the storm, a shadow moved. A rider. At first, Eliza thought her mind was deceiving her. The storm had been playing tricks on her ears for hours, howling and groaning until she imagined voices where there were none. But this was different. Beneath the shriek of the wind came the steady, rhythmic pounding of hooves against the snow. Her heart lurched. Could it truly be someone alive out here? She forced her frozen eyes open, blinking against the snowflakes that stung like glass shards. Through the swirling white, a dark shape emerged, tall and commanding against the blizzard's fury. It was a horse broad-shouldered, powerful, its breath steaming as it pressed against the storm. On its back sat a man, wrapped in thick furs and leather, his silhouette almost blending into the storm itself. Eliza's first instinct was fear. Settlers had whispered stories about Indians, about warriors who raided, who took what they wanted, who showed no mercy. Alone, with her child clutched to her breast, she trembled at the thought. But fear quickly gave way to something deeper, desperation. Whoever this rider was, whatever blood ran in his veins, he was her only hope. The rider slowed his Mustang, eyes sharp as he spotted the crumpled figure in the snow. With a swift movement, he dismounted, his boots crunching heavily into the ice. He towered over her, his face partly hidden by a fur hood, but his dark eyes gleamed with intensity. Snow clung to his braids and shoulders, yet he moved with strength. Unbothered by the storm god, Eliza tried to speak, her lips numb, her voice a rasp. "Please, my boy. He's so cold." The man knelt beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he pulled back the blanket just enough to see Daniel's face. The child's skin was pale, his tiny lips tinged blue. The warrior's jaw tightened. Without a word, he acted in one smooth motion. He lifted both mother and child from the snow as if they weighed no more than feathers. Eliza gasped, too weak to resist. He carried them to his horse, his arms steady and sure, and set them on the saddle. The animal shifted but did not protest, clearly accustomed to his master's commands. The man swung up behind them, his powerful frame shielding them from the wind. Eliza found herself pressed against his chest, Daniel cradled between them. Before she could question his intent, he pulled a thick fur blanket around all three of them, cocooning them in warmth. The scent of smoke and pine clung to the fabric, proof of fire and life things Eliza had thought lost to her forever. He leaned down, his voice deep, calm, and accented, yet firm enough to cut through the storm. "Hold on," 2 words. That was all he said. But to Eliza, they were everything. The horse surged forward, hooves pounding against snowdrifts, muscles straining with power. The wind screamed around them, but for the first time in hours, Eliza felt something other than despair. The warrior's body radiated heat through the layers, his arm steady as it held her and Daniel in place. Each stride of the horse carried them farther from the grip of death. Eliza buried her face against Daniel's hair, tears stinging her eyes not just from the cold, but from relief. She didn't know this man's name. She didn't know why he had chosen to stop and save them instead of leaving them to the snow. All she knew was that her child was alive, pressed safely between her and the stranger's steady chest. Time lost its meaning as they rode. The storm seemed endless, the world reduced to white flurries and the steady rhythm of hooves. Eliza's body ached, her mind fogged, yet she clung to the sound, the beating hooves that meant life. Occasionally, she dared glance up at her rescuer. His face was set with determination, eyes fixed ahead, searching for something unseen. He did not falter, did not waver. His presence felt like iron unyielding, immovable against the storm. At last, the horse slowed. Through the haze, Eliza saw the faint outline of stone cliffs rising from the snowy plain. A canyon, hidden by the storm, its shadows sheltering a path that curved into safety. The rider guided the horse with confidence, weaving through the narrow passageways as though he had traveled them countless times. Within minutes, the roar of the storm softened, muted by the canyon walls. The wind no longer cut like knives. Instead, it whistled distantly above them. Eliza's trembling lessened as the warmth of the blankets settled in. The warrior finally spoke again, his voice low but commanding. Safe now. Fire soon. Relief washed over her, but so did questions. Who was he? Why had he risked his life for hers and Daniel's? And most of all, what would he expect in return? Settlers told stories, after all. Yet when she looked up at him, she found no malice in his expression. Only resolve. Eliza held Daniel tighter, whispering a prayer of gratitude. For the first time since the storm began, hope flickered within her chest. She didn't yet know where this warrior was taking them, but she knew one truth with certainty. He had given them a chance to live. The canyon opened into a narrow hollow where jagged stone walls shielded the land from the worst of the storm. Eliza could hardly lift her head from exhaustion, but she felt the shift. The wind no longer slashed at her skin, and the snow fell softer here, swirling gently instead of blinding. The horse slowed, its hooves crunching across packed snow, until at last the warrior reined it in before the mouth of a dark cave. He swung down from the saddle with fluid strength, his boots sinking into the snow. Then, with surprising ease, he lifted Eliza and Daniel down into his arms again. She clutched her son tightly, her trembling body uncertain whether to resist or trust, but the warrior didn't falter. He carried them both inside the cave, where the faint glow of embers flickered against stone walls. Warmth. The air was different here, tinged with the scent of smoke, pine needles, and something earthy, almost medicinal. A fire pit lay in the center, flames licking at logs that had been carefully stacked. Above, a clever gap in the rock served as a chimney, letting the smoke escape. Firs lined the ground, creating a makeshift bed against the bitter stone. It was not a home in the way Eliza knew it, but in that moment, it was more beautiful than any house could have been. The warrior set them down gently near the fire. Eliza cradled Daniel close, guiding his small face toward the glow. His skin was still pale, his breaths shallow. Terror twisted her stomach. What if the cold had already gone too far? What if the ride had been too late? But the warrior was already moving. Without hesitation, he knelt by the fire, his large hands working with practiced care. He pulled a pouch from his belt and sprinkled herbs into a small clay pot filled with water, setting it on the flames. The sharp, fragrant scent filled the air, cutting through the damp chill of the cave. Eliza watched him warily, her instincts torn. She knew little of the Navajo, only what gossip in the settlements had painted. But there was no cruelty in his movements. Everything he did seemed purposeful, efficient, directed toward one goal, saving her child. He retrieved smooth stones from near the fire, heating them until they glowed faintly, then wrapped them in animal hide. He gestured for Daniel, his eyes meeting Eliza's with a quiet authority. For a moment, she hesitated, her protective instincts flaring. But then she looked down at her boy, limp in her arms, and she knew she had no choice. With trembling hands, she allowed the warrior to take him. Her breath caught as the man pressed the warm bundles against Daniel's small body, tucking him in layers of fur. He murmured something in his own tongue, words soft and steady, almost like a prayer. Then he held the steaming pot near Daniel's face, letting the boy breathe in the herbal vapor. Slowly, color began to creep back into Daniel's cheeks. His lips softened from blue to a faint shade of pink. His breathing grew less ragged, more even. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. Relief and disbelief washed over her all at once. She reached for her son's hand, clutching it tightly, whispering, "Stay with me, darling. Stay with Mama." The warrior did not interrupt her, but his eyes lingered on the boy with the same fierce determination he had shown in the storm. At last he looked at Eliza and spoke, his deep voice quiet but certain. "He live, strong boy." The words struck her like a blessing. She pressed her face into her son's hair, sobbing silently. It was the first time in hours, perhaps days, that she truly believed Daniel might survive. Exhaustion tugged at her, yet she forced herself to lift her gaze to the man who had carried them from death's edge. He was kneeling by the fire, his profile lit by the orange glow. His face was weathered by wind and sun, strong yet calm. A long scar traced the line of his jaw, but it did not mar him. It gave him the look of someone who had survived battles, both with men and with nature. Eliza wanted to speak, to ask him why he had helped her, why he had risked so much. But the words caught in her throat. She was a settler woman, alone, and he was a Navajo warrior, two worlds that did not meet except in stories that rarely ended kindly. Yet here they were, sharing warmth, sharing breath, and sharing the fragile thread of a child's survival. The warrior stirred the fire, then draped another fur around her shoulders. His touch was brief, impersonal, but the gesture carried weight. He did not see her as a burden. He saw her as a life worth saving. For the first time since the storm began, Eliza's body relaxed. She leaned back against the cave wall, holding Daniel close, and let the warmth seep into her bones. The fire cracked and hissed. The herbs filled the cave with a sharp comfort, and the warrior's quiet presence anchored her in the moment. As her eyes drifted shut, one thought echoed in her weary mind. She owed this man her son's life, and no fear, no prejudice, no boundary could ever erase that truth. The fire crackled steadily, casting golden light that danced across the cave's stone walls. Outside, the storm still raged, its howl muffled now by the canyon's embrace, but in here, warmth and life pulsed back into the air. Daniel slept soundly, bundled in furs with the heated stones pressed close, his little chest rising and falling in gentle rhythm. Each breath he drew steadied Eliza's heart a little more. For the first time since her husband's death, she let herself exhale without fear of what the next moment might bring. The warrior sat across the fire, his broad shoulders outlined by the glow. He had removed his hood and furs, revealing long black braids tied with leather cords. His skin bore the weathered strength of someone who had lived all his life beneath the open sky. His dark eyes were sharp but not unkind. They carried a weight Eliza couldn't name, as though he had seen much and endured more. She wanted to thank him. Words pressed at the back of her throat, but they felt too small for what he had done. What words could possibly match the gravity of saving her child's life? Still, she tried. You saved us. I don't know how to thank you." The warrior studied her quietly for a moment. Then he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than pride. His voice was deep, measured. "I saw you in the snow. I could not leave you there." Simple words, but they settled heavily in her chest. Silence stretched between them for a while, broken only by the crackle of flames. Eliza shifted, pulling the fur closer around her shoulders. The warmth seeped into her bones, thawing not only her frozen limbs but something deeper, her guarded heart. The longer she sat in his presence, the more she felt compelled to speak. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps gratitude, or perhaps the strange intimacy of survival shared in a storm. Whatever it was, the words spilled before she could stop them. "My husband died last spring," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Fever took him quick. Left me and Daniel alone on a patch of land too poor to grow anything worth keeping. His family, they wanted the land back. Said it wasn't mine without him. So I left." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. I thought if I kept moving west, I'd find a place for us. Somewhere safe. Somewhere we could start over. She didn't know why she was confessing to this stranger, but once she began, she couldn't stop. I thought I was strong enough, that I could make it alone. But when the storm came, her voice broke, tears stinging her eyes. She bit her lip, ashamed of the weakness that bled through her words, across the fire. The warrior's gaze softened, though his face remained unreadable. He let her speak, not interrupting, as though he understood the need to let grief spill like water from a broken vessel. When she fell silent, he stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing upward. "My people know loss too," he said at last. His voice was low, steady, carrying the cadence of memory. "We had homes, fields, sheep. The soldiers came, took our land, burned our hogans, drove us on the long walk." His jaw tightened. "Many died. The old, the children. My father. My mother." Eliza's breath caught. She had heard whispers in the settlements of the Navajo being forced from their homes, but they had been spoken with indifference, as if the suffering of natives was somehow less real. Hearing it now, spoken plainly by the man before her, stripped away the distance of rumor. His grief mirrored hers, different in shape but the same in weight. "I was only a boy," he continued, staring into the fire. "I learned early that to survive, we must carry pain but not let it break us." The words resonated deep within her. She glanced at Daniel, sleeping peacefully, and thought of all she had endured since John's death. Hadn't she been doing the same, carrying pain, refusing to break for the sake of her son? For the first time, she felt a bridge stretch across the vast gulf between them. They were not settler and native, not strangers divided by fear and prejudice. They were two souls marked by loss, bound by the same stubborn will to endure. Daniel stirred in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. The warrior's gaze softened again. "Strong boy," he said quietly. Eliza smiled faintly through her tears. "He is. Stronger than me, I think." The warrior looked at her, his eyes steady. "No, you carry him. You walk into the storm with him in your arms. That is strength." The words landed like a balm on her weary heart. For months, she had felt nothing but failure, too weak to hold the farm, too powerless to protect her son from hunger, too foolish to think she could survive alone. But here, in the glow of the fire, a man who had known suffering deeper than hers looked at her and saw strength. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks, though this time they were not born of despair. She whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe I'm stronger than I thought." The warrior did not smile, but his eyes held quiet approval. "You are." The storm outside raged on, but inside the cave, something fragile had taken root. A connection, born of firelight and shared sorrow, weaving their stories together like threads in a blanket. Eliza leaned back against the stone, watching the flames dance. For the first time in a long while, she felt she was not entirely alone. The snowstorm finally eased into silence, leaving a blanket of white across the land as if the world had been reset. Inside the Navajo warrior's shelter, the fire crackled softly, casting golden light across the rough walls and warming the air. For the first time in what felt like days, Eliza's heart wasn't pounding in terror. She sat near the fire with her son in her lap, watching the rise and fall of his tiny chest. His breathing was still fragile, but there was strength there too, a rhythm that carried the promise of survival. Eliza kept brushing the boy's damp hair from his forehead, whispering prayers of gratitude. She knew that if it hadn't been for the warrior, her child would already have been gone, buried beneath snow and despair. That thought sent a shiver through her, and she looked over at the man who had saved them. He sat across the fire, working silently with his hands. He was fashioning a wooden charm, carving it with the kind of patience that came only from years of practice. His long dark hair fell across his shoulders, and his features, sharp and strong, caught the flicker of the flames. Though he rarely spoke, his presence filled the room. Steady and unshakable. Eliza found herself watching him more than she meant to. She remembered the way he had lifted her and her boy into his saddle without hesitation, the way his voice had been calm and commanding even when the storm raged around them. She felt an unfamiliar pull in her chest, something that went beyond gratitude. Her child stirred, coughing weakly. The warrior's eyes flicked up, sharp and attentive. He set aside his carving and moved closer, placing a warm hand gently on the boy's chest. Then, with practiced skill, he reached for a small pouch and drew out dried herbs. He crushed them, mixing them with hot water, creating a bitter-smelling brew. "Drink," he said simply, his deep voice breaking the quiet. He held the cup to the boy's lips, and though the child grimaced, he swallowed. Eliza could only watch in awe, realizing this man was not only strong but also a healer. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." The warrior looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he simply said, "You have already paid. Your child lives." "That is enough." The words struck her deeply. There was no demand in his tone, no expectation of reward. He had saved them because it was the right thing to do. In a world that often felt cruel and unforgiving, such kindness was rare, and it stirred something inside her, something fragile but undeniable. As the hours passed, Eliza and the warrior fell into a quiet rhythm. He prepared food, offering her roasted venison and warm broth while she kept watch over her son. Their words were few, but in the silence, an understanding grew. She began to sense his solitude, the way he carried himself like a man who had fought many battles, not just against nature but against life itself. When her boy finally drifted into a deeper, steadier sleep, Eliza allowed herself a moment to rest. She leaned against the wall, her eyes heavy, but her heart strangely light. She caught the warrior watching her, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. It was not a look of ownership or pity, it was one of quiet recognition, as if they had both survived storms that had scarred them in different ways. Eliza turned away, her cheeks burning, but the warmth in her chest remained. For years, she had lived only for her son, her own dreams buried beneath struggle. Yet now, sitting by this fire, she felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. Not just for her child's survival, but for the possibility that life still had more to give. Outside, the storm was gone, leaving behind a hushed, peaceful night. Inside, another kind of storm was building, gentler, quieter, but just as powerful. Eliza didn't know what the days ahead would bring. She didn't know if this man would remain in her life once the snow melted. But she knew one thing with certainty: the warrior had not only saved her child's life, he had awakened something in her heart that she thought had died long ago. And as she sat in the glow of the fire, listening to her son's steady breathing and the warrior's quiet movements, Eliza allowed herself to dream just a little of what tomorrow might hold. When morning came, the storm had finally broken for good. The air outside the shelter was crisp and clean, the snow glistening like tiny diamonds under the pale light of dawn. Eliza blinked against the brightness as she stepped outside, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. The silence of the world was almost overwhelming, so still, so pure, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Behind her, she could hear her child stirring, his breathing stronger now, his cough fading. A rush of gratitude swept through her as she realized he was truly on the mend. The Navajo warrior had done what she could not. He had given her boy the strength to survive. She turned to see him outside as well, already saddling his horse. His movements were sure and efficient, his posture upright and commanding. There was no hesitation in him, no wasted motion. He carried himself as a man who had always known his place in the world. Yet as he glanced at her, there was a softness in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, as though the harsh storm had carved away some of his reserve. "Your child will live," he said quietly, almost as a statement of fact. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes. She nodded, unable to find words strong enough to match what she felt. "You saved us both," she whispered. "I'll never forget." He looked away toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to climb, painting the snow in gold and rose. "The storm was not meant to take you," he said. "Sometimes the Great Spirit guides us where we are needed." There was something reverent in his tone, something that made Eliza's heart ache. She had always believed her journey was one of survival, alone one step after another, clinging to her son as the only reason to keep moving. But now, listening to this man, she began to wonder if perhaps fate had brought her here for more than survival. They returned inside to gather what little she had, left her threadbare shawl, a small pouch of dried food, and her boy's favorite wooden toy. Everything else had been lost to the storm. As she folded the toy into her satchel, her child opened his eyes and whispered, "Mama?" Eliza leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I'm here, my love," she said softly. The boy's gaze drifted toward the warrior, who stood silently by the fire, his tall frame casting shadows against the wall. The child's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Is he an angel?" Eliza's breath caught. She wanted to laugh, but the tears came first. "Maybe he is," she whispered, brushing her son's hair back. "Maybe he is." When they were ready to leave, the warrior lifted the boy with effortless strength, placing him carefully into the saddle before helping Eliza climb up behind him. She held her son tightly as the horse moved forward, carrying them across the vast snow-laden land. Each step felt like a promise that they were not walking back into despair, but into a life renewed. As they traveled, Eliza found herself leaning into the warrior's solid presence. His silence was no longer intimidating. Instead, it comforted her. She didn't need words to know what was in his heart. He had already spoken through his actions, through the fire that kept them warm, through the herbs that healed her child, through the strength that carried them all. Hours passed, and finally, the horizon revealed the faint outline of a small settlement. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of distant voices carried across the snowy plain. It was a place of safety, a place where she and her child could begin again. But even as she looked at the settlement, Eliza's heart tugged in two directions. One part yearned for the security of other people, for a chance to rebuild her life. The other part whispered a question she didn't dare speak aloud. What if he leaves? What if I never see him again? As though sensing her thoughts, the warrior turned his head slightly. "You will be safe here," he said simply. Her heart sank. "And you?" she asked softly. He paused before answering, his gaze fixed on the endless sky. "I will go where I am needed. That has always been my way." Silence hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Eliza wanted to beg him to stay, to admit that her heart had begun to depend on his presence. But she held her tongue, afraid of shattering the delicate bond between them. When they reached the settlement's edge, he helped her and her son down. For a moment, the three of them stood together in the snow, the world hushed around them. Her son slipped his small hand into the warrior's, and the sight nearly undid her. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice breaking. The warrior looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold both distance and longing. Then, with a small nod, he turned to leave. Eliza's chest tightened, but before he mounted his horse, he paused. "I may return," he said quietly. "If the Great Spirit wills it." Her heart leapt with fragile hope. She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Then I will wait," she whispered, though whether he heard or not, she couldn't say. As he rode away, the snow began to fall again, soft, gentle flakes drifting from the sky. Eliza held her child close, her heart full. They were alive. They were safe. And though the future was uncertain, she knew this. The warrior had given them more than life. He had given them hope. And sometimes hope was enough to change everything.